Dr. Ethan Blake had always prided himself on his scientific objectivity, his ability to observe phenomena without letting personal bias cloud his judgment. 20 years as a xenobiologist had taught him to see past surface appearances and focus on the underlying structures that made life so endlessly fascinating. But as he stood trapped in Research Lab 7 with the emergency lockdown seals engaged and red quarantine lights bathing everything in hellish illumination, he found his famous objectivity completely deserting him. The reason was Kael'thera, the Vorthack data analyst who had been running archival searches when the contamination alert triggered the facility's automatic isolation protocols. She stood at the environmental control panel, her long fingers dancing across the interface with practiced efficiency, and Ethan couldn't seem to look away from her. He'd seen Vorthack before, of course. They were scattered throughout the outer colonies and research stations, usually working in positions that required minimal contact with other species. But he'd never really looked at one, never taken the time to observe the subtle details that made them unique among the galaxy's sentient races. Kael'thera's skin was pale as moonlight, with a translucent quality that revealed the dark network of veins beneath like delicate tracery. Her ears were long and elegantly pointed, currently tilted forward in concentration as she worked to maintain their life support systems. Most striking were her eyes, large and expressive, shifting from deep violet to silver as her emotional state changed with the stress of their situation. The atmospheric processors are functioning within normal parameters, she reported without looking at him, her voice carrying the musical quality that characterized Vorthack's speech. The quarantine should be lifted within 18 hours, assuming the contamination readings continue to decline. Ethan nodded, though she wasn't watching for his reaction. Good. That gives us time to run a full analysis on the samples that triggered the alert. He moved to the lab's main workstation, but found his attention divided between the data on his screens and the way Kael'thera moved through the confined space. There was a fluid grace to her movements, an economy of motion that spoke of someone accustomed to making herself as unobtrusive as possible. "Dr. Blake," she said suddenly, still not turning to face him, "is there something wrong? You seem distracted." Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. "Sorry, I was just... I've never worked closely with a Vorthack before. I'm curious about your people's adaptive responses to different atmospheric conditions." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. Kael'thera finally turned from the environmental controls, her eyes now showing flecks of amber that he suspected indicated wariness. "My people adapt to whatever conditions we encounter," she said carefully. "We have little choice in the matter, given our circumstances." There was something in her tone that made Ethan set aside his data analysis. "What circumstances?" Kael'thera's laugh was bitter, causing her eyes to darken to a stormy gray. "You don't know. How refreshing. Most species learn about the cursed Vorthack as soon as they achieve interstellar travel." "I know the basics," Ethan said honestly. "Your people are nomadic, you work primarily in technical fields, and there are some historical tensions with other species. But I've never understood why." For a long moment, Kael'thera simply stared at him, her eyes cycling through colors he couldn't interpret. Then she moved to one of the lab's observation windows, looking out at the stars visible beyond Meridian 7's rotating hull. "300 years ago, my people were dying," she said quietly. "A plague swept through our worlds, killing billions and leaving the survivors changed. Our appearance, our biology, everything that marked us as Vorthack became associated with death and disease in the minds of other species." Ethan joined her at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "But the plague ended, didn't it? Your people recovered." "Our bodies recovered," Kael'thera corrected. "Our reputation never did. We became the species that others avoid, the reminder of mortality that no one wants to see. We work in isolation, live in the margins, and accept that we will never be welcomed as equals." She turned to look at him then, and Ethan saw something vulnerable in her expression that made his chest tighten. "We know what other species think when they look at us," she continued. "We see the fear, the disgust, the pity. We learn to make ourselves invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to never expect more than basic tolerance. Her eyes had shifted to a deep blue that seemed to reflect infinite sadness. "I could never be beautiful to a human," she said with quiet conviction. "Your species values symmetry, familiar proportions, recognizable features. I am everything that humans instinctively fear, pale, strange, marked by death." Ethan stared at her, genuinely shocked by her words. "Kael'thara, that's not." "Please," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "You don't need to offer false comfort. I have lived with these truths my entire life. I know what I am, and what I am not." But even as she spoke, Ethan realized she was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Because he had been looking at her, really looking, and what he saw wasn't frightening or grotesque or pitiable. What he saw was fascinating. The translucent quality of her skin didn't reveal death, it revealed the intricate beauty of her circulatory system, like living art beneath the surface. Her elongated ears weren't alien and disturbing, they were elegant, expressive, perfectly adapted for the acute hearing that made her people such excellent data analysts. And her color-shifting eyes weren't unsettling, they were the most honest form of communication he'd ever encountered, revealing emotions with a clarity that human expressions could never match. "You're wrong," he said quietly. Kael'thara's eyes snapped to his face, shifting to startled gold. "Excuse me?" "You're wrong about what humans see when they look at you," Ethan continued, his scientific training finally catching up with his emotional response. "Maybe other humans, maybe most humans, but not all of us. Not me." He turned to face her fully, noting the way her breathing had changed, the way her eyes were cycling rapidly through colors he was beginning to recognize as confusion and something that might have been hope. "When I look at you, I see adaptation. Evolution. Survival. I see a species that faced extinction and emerged transformed but intact. I see intelligence, grace, and a kind of beauty that has nothing to do with familiar proportions and everything to do with the complexity of life itself." Kael'thara's eyes had settled on a warm amber that seemed to glow in the lab's artificial lighting. "Dr. Blake." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "And I want you to know that I've been trying not to stare at you for the past 2 hours, not because I'm repelled, but because I'm fascinated. Because I think you're one of the most beautiful beings I've ever seen." The silence that followed his admission was broken only by the hum of the lab's environmental systems. Kael'thara stood perfectly still, her eyes now showing swirls of color he'd never seen before, deep purples shot through with silver and gold, like a nebula captured in living tissue. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered finally. "I'm a scientist," Ethan replied with a slight smile. "I make my living knowing what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that whoever convinced your people they were cursed or ugly or unworthy was suffering from a severe failure of imagination." For the first time since the quarantine began, Kael'thara smiled, a hesitant expression that transformed her entire face and made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. "The quarantine will be lifted in 15 hours, she said softly. Yes, Ethan agreed, though he found himself hoping the contamination readings would take their time declining. 15 hours. As they returned to their respective workstations, Ethan caught himself stealing glances at his companion, marveling at the way her eyes continued to shift through that extraordinary spectrum of colors. He had the distinct impression that she was experiencing emotions she'd never expected to feel, and he was honored to be witnessing something so private and profound. For the first time in 3 centuries, a Vorthak was allowing herself to believe that she might be seen as something other than a reminder of mortality. And Ethan Blake, xenobiologist and accidental ambassador for human appreciation of alien beauty, couldn't wait to spend the next 15 hours proving her right. The quarantine stretched into its second day when the life support systems began showing irregularities that required both Ethan's biological expertise and Kael'thara's technical knowledge to resolve. Working side by side at the environmental console, Ethan found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the way her eyes shifted to focused silver when she was concentrating and how her elongated ears tilted at slightly different angles depending on what she was listening to. The atmospheric recyclers are operating at only 70% efficiency, Kael'thara reported, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. If this continues, we'll start seeing carbon dioxide buildup within 6 hours. Ethan leaned closer to examine her readings, inadvertently bringing himself within arm's reach of her. He caught a faint scent that reminded him of ozone after a lightning storm, clean and electric. Can you isolate which components are failing? Already done, she replied, pulling up a three-dimensional schematic that floated between them. The primary filters in sections 7 through 12 are showing particulate saturation beyond normal parameters. They'll need to be replaced manually. As she explained the repair procedure, Ethan found himself watching the way her translucent skin seemed to glow when backlit by the holographic display. The dark tracery of veins beneath the surface formed patterns that were almost artistic, like living calligraphy written across her throat and temples. Dr. Blake? Kael'Thara's voice held a note of uncertainty. Are you listening to me? Ethan blinked, realizing he'd been staring again. Sorry, yes. Manual replacement of the filters. You have remarkable dermal vascularization. The moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to crawl under the nearest workbench. Complimenting someone's blood vessel patterns was probably not appropriate under any circumstances, let alone when trapped in a confined space with a member of a species that most of the galaxy treated as pariahs. But instead of looking offended or disturbed, Kael'Thara tilted her head in what appeared to be curiosity. You find our vascular visibility interesting? Fascinating, Ethan admitted, figuring he'd already crossed the line of professional propriety. From a biological standpoint, it's incredibly efficient. Most species have to rely on external indicators of health and emotional state. Your people were their internal processes like living art. Kael'Thara's eyes shifted to a warm gold, and she looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. We were taught to hide it, she said quietly. To wear clothing that covers as much as possible, to avoid bright lighting that makes the patterns more visible. Why would you hide something so beautiful? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. Her eyes went through a rapid cycle of colors, gold to silver to deep blue and back to gold, before settling on something that looked almost like hope. Because other species find it disturbing, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The sight of our internal structures reminds them of death, of vulnerability, of their own mortality. Ethan moved to the supply locker to gather the tools they'd need for the filter replacement, using the moment to organize his thoughts. Kael'Thara, can I ask you something personal? More personal than commenting on my circulatory system? There was a hint of humor in her voice that made him smile. Have you ever actually asked a member of another species what they see when they look at you? Or have you just accepted what your people have always believed? She was quiet for so long that Ethan wondered if he'd overstepped. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. We learned not to ask questions that might have painful answers. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, crawling through maintenance shafts and replacing the clogged filters that were threatening their air supply. In the confined spaces, Ethan became even more aware of the graceful efficiency of Kael'Thara's movements, the way she seemed to flow through spaces that required him to squeeze and contort. Your people must have evolved from an arboreal species, he observed as they emerged from a particularly narrow access tunnel. The flexibility, the spatial awareness, you're perfectly adapted for three-dimensional environments. Kael'Thara paused in cleaning the filter housing, her eyes shifting to curious amber. How did you know that? Most xenobiologists focus on our post-plague characteristics and ignore our evolutionary history. Most xenobiologists are idiots, Ethan replied without thinking, then caught himself. Present company excluded, of course. I meant that they get so focused on obvious differences that they miss the underlying patterns that make each species remarkable. And what patterns do you see in me? The question was asked quietly, as if she was afraid of the answer. Ethan considered his response carefully. They were sitting on the lab floor, tools scattered around them, and Kael'Thara's eyes were cycling through colors he was beginning to recognize as nervousness mixed with curiosity. I see someone whose ancestors swung through forest canopies on worlds I can't even imagine, he said slowly. I see evolutionary adaptations that speak of intelligence, cooperation, and a deep connection to the natural environments you evolved in. The translucent skin that lets you monitor your own health and emotional state, the color-changing eyes that allow for complex nonverbal communication, the acute hearing that comes from species that needed to navigate by sound. He gestured to her hands, noting the long, delicate fingers. Those aren't the hands of a species marked by death. Those are the hands of builders, artists, people who created something beautiful before the plague changed your circumstances. Kael'Thara's eyes had settled on a deep purple shot through with silver, and Ethan could see her breathing had changed. We were architects, she said suddenly. Before the plague, before we became nomads, we built cities that grew like living things, structures that were part art, part engineering, part biology. What happened to them? Abandoned when we had to flee. The other species were so afraid of contagion that they wouldn't even let us dismantle them properly. For all I know, they're still standing on dead worlds, slowly being reclaimed by the forests we once called home. The sadness in her voice made Ethan's chest tighten. Tell me about them. The cities, I mean. For the next 2 hours, as they finished the filter replacements and ran diagnostics on the life support systems, Kael'Thara talked about her people's lost civilization. She described spires that curved like growing trees, bridges that spanned impossible distances with gossamer strength, buildings that adjusted their internal climate based on the needs of their inhabitants. We believe that technology should serve life, not dominate it, she explained, her eyes bright with gold as she lost herself in the memories of stories passed down from her grandparents. Everything we built was designed to work with natural systems, to enhance rather than replace the environments we inhabited. Ethan listened with growing fascination, taking notes on his data pad when she wasn't looking. What she was describing wasn't the work of a primitive or cursed species, but of master engineers and artists who had achieved a level of integration between technology and biology that current galactic civilization could only dream of. Why don't other species know about this? He asked. This level of technological achievement should be part of the historical record. Kael'Thara's expression grew bitter, her eyes darkening to stormy gray. Because no one wanted to preserve the achievements of a cursed species. It was easier to forget what we had been and focus only on what we became after the plague. But you remember. Some of us do. We keep the old stories, the old knowledge, hoping that someday. She trailed off, her eyes cycling rapidly through colors. Someday what? Someday someone might want to listen, she finished quietly. Ethan set down his data pad and looked at her directly, noting the way her eyes had settled on a color he'd never seen before. A deep blue-green that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. I want to listen, he said simply. I want to hear everything you're willing to tell me about your people, your history, your culture. Not as research subjects, but as someone who's beginning to understand that the galaxy lost something irreplaceable when it decided your people weren't worth knowing. The silence that followed was broken by the soft chime of the quarantine system announcing that contamination levels had dropped below critical thresholds. In 6 hours, the lockdown would be lifted, and they would return to their separate lives and duties. But something had changed between them in that sterile lab, something that made the approaching end of their isolation feel less like rescue and more like interruption. Ethan, Kael'Thara said, using his first name for the first time, when this is over, when we return to our normal routines, will you still want to listen? He looked into her eyes, now showing swirls of hope and fear in equal measure, and realized that the last 48 hours had fundamentally altered his understanding of beauty, worth, and what it meant to truly see another being. Yes, he said without hesitation. For as long as you're willing to share, I want to listen. And I want the rest of the galaxy to listen too. For the first time since he'd known her, Kael'Thara smiled without restraint, her eyes blazing with colors that seemed to capture starlight and transform it into something entirely new. The quarantine lifted at 0800 hours station time, but Ethan found himself reluctant to leave Research Lab 7. The past 3 days had felt like a glimpse into a world he never knew existed, and returning to his normal routine felt like closing a book before learning how the story ended. Kael'thara seemed equally hesitant to resume their separate lives. As they gathered their personal effects and prepared to return to their respective duties, she moved with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain emotional control. "Thank you," she said formally as they stood by the unsealing doors. "For your assistance with the life support repairs, and for listening." Ethan wanted to say something profound, something that would convey how fundamentally the experience had changed his perspective. Instead, he settled for the simple truth: "Thank you for sharing." "And Kael'thara? This doesn't have to end here." Her eyes shifted to hopeful amber, but before she could respond, the lab doors opened and they were swept back into the bustling routine of Meridian 7. Over the following days, Ethan found himself seeking excuses to visit the archives where Kael'thara worked. He claimed to be researching historical precedents for atmospheric contamination events, but his real interest was in continuing their conversations about Vortak culture and history. "You're spending a lot of time in the archives lately," observed Dr. Sarah Kim, his research partner, as they reviewed data in the station's main laboratory. "Finding anything interesting?" "More than I expected," Ethan replied honestly. "Did you know that the Vortak developed biointegrated architecture 3 centuries before any other known species achieved similar technology?" Sarah looked up from her microscope with raised eyebrows. "You're getting this from Kael'thara, aren't you?" "Ethan, you need to be careful about accepting historical claims from a source that might not be objective." "What do you mean?" "I mean that isolated species sometimes embellish their past achievements to compensate for their current circumstances," Sarah said diplomatically. "The Vortak are essentially refugees, working menial jobs and living on the margins of galactic society. It would be natural for them to romanticize what they've lost." Ethan felt a flash of irritation at the implicit dismissal of everything Kael'thara had shared with him. "Have you ever actually talked to a Vortak about their history? Or are you just repeating assumptions?" Sarah's expression grew concerned. "Ethan, I'm worried about you. You've been different since the quarantine incident. More, invested in things that aren't really our concern." Before Ethan could formulate a response that wouldn't sound offensive, Commander Jake Morrison entered the lab with his usual military efficiency. "Dar. Blake, I need to speak with you about your recent research requests." Ethan followed Morrison to his office, noting the commander's unusually formal demeanor. Once the door was sealed, Morrison settled behind his desk with the expression of someone preparing for an unpleasant conversation. "Ethan, I'm going to be direct," Morrison began. "There are concerns about your recent interaction with the Vortak analyst. Several crew members have reported seeing you spending extended time in the archives, and there are questions about whether this represents appropriate professional behavior." "I'm conducting research," Ethan replied carefully. "The quarantine incident exposed gaps in our knowledge about species integration and historical precedents. I'm trying to fill those gaps by interviewing a single individual whose people are known to have reliability issues." Ethan felt his temper rising. "What kind of reliability issues?" Morrison pulled up a file on his desktop display. "Psychological profiles indicate that many Vortak suffer from cultural displacement syndrome, leading to fantasies about their species' past importance. They're also known to form intense, inappropriate attachments to individuals from other species who show them any kind of positive attention." The implication hit Ethan like a physical blow. "You think she's lying to me about her people's history, and that she's, developing romantic feelings that I'm somehow encouraging?" "I think you're a compassionate person who may not recognize when professional boundaries are being crossed," Morrison replied diplomatically. "The Vortak are a tragic species, but they're also potentially problematic from a psychological standpoint. I'm recommending that you limit future contact to essential professional interactions." Ethan stared at the commander, struggling to process the casual dismissal of everything he'd learned about Kael'thara and her people. "Jake, have you ever actually read any comprehensive studies about Vortak psychology and culture? Or are you working from second-hand reports and assumptions?" Morrison's expression grew stern. I'm working from 3 centuries of documented interactions, Ethan. The Vorthak are survivors of a species-wide catastrophe. That kind of trauma leaves marks, and it's not our job to try to heal them. That evening, Ethan found himself standing outside the archives after normal hours, debating whether to honor Morrison's recommendations or trust his own judgment. The decision was made for him when Kael'thara emerged from the data storage facility, her eyes immediately shifting to concerned gold when she saw him. "Ethan? Is everything all right? You seem troubled." He looked at her, noting the genuine concern in her expression, the way her entire posture oriented toward him as if his well-being mattered to her. Morrison's warnings about inappropriate attachment seemed laughably inadequate to describe the complex person standing before him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "And I need you to be completely honest." Her eyes shifted to wary silver. "Of course. Are you telling me the truth about your people's history? About the cities and the architecture and the technology? Or are you romanticizing things because you want them to be true?" The question clearly hurt her. Kael'thara's eyes went through a rapid cycle of colors before settling on something that looked like disappointment mixed with resignation. "You've been talking to your colleagues," she said quietly. "They've told you that Vorthak are unreliable, that we fabricate stories about our past glory to make ourselves feel important." "I need to know," Ethan said firmly. "Because if I'm going to argue for a comprehensive study of your people's history and culture, I need to know that I'm not building that argument on wishful thinking." Kael'thara stared at him for a long moment, her eyes settling on a deep blue that seemed to reflect infinite sadness. Then she turned and walked back into the archives, gesturing for him to follow. "Computer, display personal file Kael'thara 779, authorization gamma," she said once they were inside. The room filled with holographic displays showing architectural schematics, historical records, and what appeared to be actual photographs of the cities she had described. Ethan moved through the displays in growing amazement, recognizing the elegant curves and biointegrated designs from her descriptions but seeing them now in technical detail that spoke of genuine engineering achievement. "This is just my family's archive," Kael'thara said quietly. "Every Vorthak carries similar records. We preserve what we can of what we were, not because we're delusional, but because we hope that someday someone will care enough to help us rebuild." Ethan studied a holographic model of a spire that seemed to grow from the ground like a living tree, its internal structure visible through translucent walls. "These are real. These cities actually existed." "They existed, and some may still exist on worlds that other species won't visit because of our curse," Kael'thara replied. "We have coordinates, we have building plans, we have everything except the political standing to convince anyone that our achievements matter." She moved to another display, showing what appeared to be a family portrait, several Vorthak in flowing robes, standing before one of the architectural marvels. "This is my great-grandmother, Thelkara. She was one of the primary architects of the Theshan Grand Spire. She died in the plague, but not before teaching my grandmother everything she knew about biointegrated construction." Ethan looked from the historical records to Kael'thara's face, seeing the resemblance in bone structure and the elegant lines of her features. "Why hasn't any of this been preserved in the Galactic historical databases?" "Because when you're fleeing for your life, historical preservation isn't your first priority," she said bitterly. "And because the species that might have helped us document our achievements were too afraid of contagion to get close enough to care." The weight of what she was showing him, the scale of loss, the magnitude of cultural destruction, left Ethan struggling for words. This wasn't the romanticized nostalgia of a displaced people, this was the documented record of a civilization that had achieved wonders and then been forced to abandon them to survive. "Kael'thara," he said finally, "I want to help you preserve this. All of it. I want to create a comprehensive record that the galaxy can't ignore or dismiss." Her eyes blazed with colors he'd never seen before, hope and fear and desperate longing all swirling together. "You would do that? Even knowing that it would probably end your career at this station? Even knowing that most of your colleagues would consider it academic suicide?" Ethan looked around the archive, taking in the scope of what had been preserved by a people who had refused to let their heritage disappear despite 3 centuries of exile and rejection. Especially knowing that, he said firmly. Because if we don't preserve this, if we don't share what your people achieved, then the galaxy will have lost something irreplaceable. And I can't live with being part of that loss. For the second time since he'd known her, Kael'thara smiled without restraint, her eyes blazing with hope that seemed to light up the entire archive. Then, she said softly, "We have work to do." As they began planning the most ambitious xenocultural documentation project Meridian 7 had ever seen, Ethan realized that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer just a scientist studying an interesting species, he was an advocate for a people whose beauty and achievements had been hidden by prejudice and fear. And looking at Kael'thara as she pulled up centuries of preserved knowledge, her eyes bright with the possibility of being truly seen for the first time in generations, he knew he had never been more certain of anything in his life. The comprehensive documentation project took on a life of its own over the following months. What had begun as Ethan's personal quest to preserve Vorthac cultural history evolved into something approaching a revolution in xenocultural studies. Working together in the archives, often late into the station's night cycle, he and Kael'thara assembled a record that challenged 3 centuries of galactic assumptions about her people. The biointegration principles here are at least 50 years ahead of current technology, Ethan observed, studying holographic schematics of a Vorthac medical facility that could literally grow organs from stem cells harvested from the patient. If we could reverse engineer even a fraction of these techniques, we'd have to find the cities first, Kael'thara replied, though her eyes showed hopeful gold as she watched him work. And convince the galactic community that worlds they've avoided for 3 centuries might be worth exploring again. Their collaboration had deepened beyond mere professional partnership. Ethan found himself looking forward to their evening work sessions not just for the remarkable discoveries they were making, but for the quiet moments when Kael'thara would share stories about her childhood, her dreams, her fears about what would happen when their project was complete. "Sometimes I wonder if this is wise," she admitted one evening as they took a break from cataloging architectural innovations. "Once we publish this research, I won't be invisible anymore. Neither will my people. That could bring attention we're not prepared for." Ethan looked up from his notes, seeing the uncertainty in her color-shifting eyes. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," she said honestly. "For 3 centuries, we've survived by staying in the shadows, by accepting whatever scraps of acceptance other species were willing to give us. This project, it's asking the galaxy to see us as equals. What if they refuse? What if we lose even what little we have?" Before Ethan could formulate a response, his personal communicator chimed with an urgent message from Commander Morrison. "Dr. Blake, report to Conference Room 3 immediately. Priority Alpha." They exchanged glances, both recognizing that Priority Alpha meant either a major discovery or a significant problem. Given the controversial nature of their work, Ethan suspected it was the latter. Conference Room 3 was crowded with senior staff when Ethan arrived, including Morrison, Dr. Kim, and several others he recognized as department heads. At the head of the table sat someone he'd never met, a stern-looking woman wearing the uniform of the Galactic Cultural Authority. "Dr. Blake," Morrison began without preamble, "this is Inspector Valdez from the Cultural Authority. She's here to discuss your recent research activities." Inspector Valdez opened a file on the table's display screen, showing excerpts from Ethan's documentation project. "Dr. Blake, you've been conducting unauthorized xenocultural research using station resources. More concerning, you've been working with a Vorthac individual whose psychological profile raises questions about the reliability of your data sources." Ethan felt his temper rising. "Inspector, I've been conducting legitimate research into a previously understudied culture. Everything I've done has been within established academic protocols. Protocols that require oversight and peer review," Valdez replied coldly. "You've been working in isolation with a single subject whose species is known for psychological instability and historical fabrication. The Cultural Authority has received complaints that your work may be giving false legitimacy to Vorthac cultural claims." "Complaints from whom?" Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. From species whose own historical records contradict some of the achievements your research attributes to the Vorthack. The Centauran Alliance, in particular, has questioned whether biointegrated architecture was actually a Vorthack innovation. Ethan stared around the table, seeing varying degrees of embarrassment and concern on the faces of colleagues he'd worked with for years. So we're dismissing 3 centuries of preserved documentation because it makes other species uncomfortable. We're questioning the objectivity of research conducted without proper academic safeguards, Inspector Valdez said firmly. I'm here to inform you that the Cultural Authority is placing a moratorium on your project pending a full review of your methodologies and source materials. And Kael'thara? The Vorthack individual will be transferred to another facility where she can be properly evaluated for psychological stability and potential cultural delusions. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Not only were they dismissing years of careful documentation, but they were treating Kael'thara like a specimen whose testimony couldn't be trusted. Inspector, with respect, you're making decisions based on prejudices rather than evidence. I'm making decisions based on established protocols for dealing with potentially unreliable sources, Valdez replied. The Vorthack have a documented history of psychological issues stemming from their species-wide trauma. It's entirely possible that this individual has convinced herself that exaggerated stories about her people's past are accurate historical records. Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Have any of you actually examined the documentation we've compiled? The technical specifications, the historical photographs, the detailed architectural plans? Are you seriously suggesting that a psychologically unstable individual fabricated centuries of consistent, technically accurate information? The room fell silent. Finally, Dr. Kim spoke up. Ethan, we're not questioning your integrity. But you've become emotionally invested in this project in ways that might compromise your judgment. Emotionally invested, Ethan repeated slowly. Yes, I am emotionally invested. I'm invested in truth, in justice, in not allowing the galaxy's most remarkable architectural and biological innovations to be dismissed because of prejudice masquerading as caution. He looked around the table at faces he'd considered friends and colleagues. I'm also emotionally invested in Kael'thara as a person. She's brilliant, honest, and has shown me achievements that could revolutionize how we think about technology and biological integration. If caring about that makes me professionally compromised, then I'll wear that compromise as a badge of honor. Inspector Valdez's expression grew stern. Dar. Blake, I'm ordering you to cease all contact with the Vorthack subject and surrender all materials related to your unauthorized research. No, Ethan said quietly. Excuse me? No. I won't surrender documentation that represents the preserved heritage of an entire civilization, and I won't abandon someone who trusted me with the most precious thing her people possess, their history. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Ethan found himself suspended from his position, his access to station resources revoked, and his personal quarters placed under security monitoring. But before the guards could escort him from the conference room, he managed to send a single encrypted message to Kael'thara's personal communicator: archive everything. Trust no one else. 2 days later, as Ethan sat in his sealed quarters contemplating the end of his career, his door chimed with an unexpected visitor. Kael'thara stood in the corridor, her eyes showing swirls of determination and fear, flanked by 2 other Vorthack he'd never seen before. These are my clan sisters, Valterra and Sythra, she said quickly. We don't have much time. The transport that's supposed to take me for psychological evaluation arrives in 6 hours. Kael'thara, I'm so sorry. I tried to protect the research, but... You did protect it, she interrupted, her eyes blazing with gold. More than that, you proved something I never thought possible. What do you mean? Valterra, the elder of the 2 newcomers, stepped forward. Dr. Blake, your documentation project has reached our clan ships. For the first time in 3 centuries, we have comprehensive proof of what we were, presented by someone from outside our species who recognizes its value. The clan elders have been discussing your work, Sydhra added. Some want to invite you to see our preserved cities on the Forbidden Worlds. Others think it's too dangerous to trust any non-Vorthak with such knowledge. Sydhra moved closer to Ethan, her eyes showing colors he'd never seen before, deep purples shot through with silver and gold like captured starlight. I convinced them that you're different. That you see us not as subjects to be studied, but as people with something valuable to offer. Ethan looked between the three Vorthak women, understanding that this was a moment that would define not just his future, but potentially the future of human-Vorthak relations. What are you asking? Come with us, Sydhra said simply. Help us document not just our historical records, but our living cities, our current innovations, our hopes for rebuilding what we lost. Help us make contact with the galaxy not as supplicants begging for acceptance, but as equals offering partnership. I'd be abandoning my career, my life here. You'd be helping to bridge a gap between civilizations, Valterra corrected. The first non-Vorthak to see our hidden achievements, the first to help us present ourselves to the galaxy on our own terms. Ethan thought about Inspector Valdez's dismissal, Morrison's warnings, Dr. Kim's concerns about his judgment. Then he looked at Sydhra, whose color-shifting eyes held depths of intelligence, creativity, and hope that 3 centuries of exile hadn't been able to extinguish. When do we leave? He asked. 6 months later, Ethan stood on the observation deck of the Vorthak clan ship Preservation, watching as they approached a world that had been listed as uninhabitable in every galactic database he'd ever consulted. Below them, crystalline cities rose from living forests, their bio-integrated spires reaching toward the sky like prayers made manifest in glass and growing wood. The Theshan Grand Spire, Sydhra said, joining him at the viewport. Her eyes were bright with colors he now knew represented joy mixed with profound satisfaction. My great-grandmother's masterpiece, still standing after all these years. Ethan marveled at the structure, recognizing the architectural principles from the archives but seeing them now in living reality. It's incredible. All of it. The preliminary reports from your documentation teams are being transmitted across Vorthak space, she continued. For the first time in 3 centuries, our people are talking about returning to some of our abandoned worlds, about rebuilding what we lost. Their research had become something neither of them had expected, not just a historical record, but a catalyst for cultural revival. The detailed documentation of Vorthak achievements was spreading through academic circles despite the cultural authorities' attempts to suppress it, and several progressive species had begun questioning the assumptions that had kept the Vorthak in exile. There's something I need to tell you, Sydhra said, her voice suddenly serious. Ethan turned from the viewport to face her, noting that her eyes had shifted to the deep blue-green that he'd learned indicated important decisions. The clan elders have offered you permanent citizenship in our society, she said. Full membership, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. You would be the first non-Vorthak ever granted such status. Ethan felt his breath catch. And what would that mean, exactly? Sydhra's eyes shifted to warm gold, and she stepped closer to him. It would mean that you would be family. Clan. Someone whose well-being matters as much as our own, and whose voice carries equal weight in our decisions. She paused, her eyes cycling through colors that spoke of hope and fear and desperate longing. It would also mean, if you chose to accept it, that we could be bonded as life partners according to Vorthak custom. That the connection we've built could become permanent. Ethan looked into her color-shifting eyes, seeing in them not just individual feelings but the reflected hopes of an entire people who had learned to dream again because someone from outside their species had finally seen them as beautiful. I told you once that I could never be beautiful to a human, she said softly. You proved me wrong about that. Now I'm asking if you might want to prove me wrong about something else. What's that? That a human and a Vorthak could build something together that neither species could create alone. Ethan reached out and took her hands, noting how her translucent skin seemed to glow in the light from the crystalline cities below. Sydhra, you've already proven that. Everything we've accomplished, everything we're going to accomplish, none of it would be possible without both of our perspectives. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. But if you're asking whether I want to make it official, whether I want to spend the rest of my life helping your people reclaim their place in the galaxy while learning what it means to be part of a family that spans star systems. Her eyes blazed with colors he'd never seen before, like aurora captured in living tissue. Yes, he said simply. To all of it. To citizenship, to bonding, to building bridges between our peoples, to proving that beauty comes in forms the galaxy is only beginning to understand. As Kael'thas smiled with unrestrained joy and the preservation settled into orbit around a world where impossible cities reached toward the stars, Ethan Blake realized that his journey had come full circle. He had begun by seeing past surface appearances to recognize the beauty in what others feared, and now he was embarking on a life dedicated to helping the galaxy learn to see with clearer eyes. Some connections, he reflected as he and his bonded partner prepared to descend to the living cities below, transcend the boundaries that species create for themselves. And sometimes, the most profound beauty is found not in the familiar, but in learning to see wonder in forms that challenge everything you thought you knew about what was possible.